Hey guys, welcome to another Note to File Live. And someday I will make the transition and it will be awesome and it won't be terrible. But guys, welcome to another Note to File Live. Appreciate you checking in. As always, love to hear you guys' questions. So make sure you get in the comments. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. Today we've got the team from Flatiron Health. Guys, good morning or noon or whatever time it is, wherever you are.
Good afternoon. I was about to grab my guitar with the music. That's fantastic.
I mean, partly, I just do this now because I get to play DJ, which was always a childhood aspiration of mine. So, it's good. That's just as important as the interview, I feel like, at this point.
Exactly.
Well, very cool. I just, before we get in too far, Craig, you've been on before. So, you're basically a vet now, but, I'd love to, hear you guys go around, give a little introduction and, tell us about yourselves.
Sure. Appreciate that, Brad. I'll just kick it off. Craig Serra, calling in from Northern New Jersey. Background in clinical development operations, all things sort of clinical research, mainly large pharma. Came to Flatiron late last year after some cancer really got quite close to home, and so wanted to try and help our industry and help sites and sponsors and of course patients from the other side. So happy to join today, and I'll leave it to or I'll send it over to Emily.
Hi there, I'm Emily Aiken. I'm the Research Network Lead at Flatiron. So I am all things sites, responsible for getting more sites using our CR technology, as well as kind of the relationships at those sites. I also come from a very long time in clinical research. I did 20 years in CROs running global clinical trials, but I really like advocating for sites and the perspective of how technology can fit in the site workflow rather than it being from above.
I love that we're seeing more of that type of role, I think, because, yes, sites complain about technology, but frankly, there's a lot of positive technology experiences too. It doesn't have to be bad, right? I think, sites want to help make that better for everybody. So I think that's cool. Again, to sort of see that you guys have that role, just to have that focus, I think is super important. Sorry to cut you off, but Miles, let's hear from you, man.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Miles Naris. I'm a senior product operations manager here at Flatiron Health. My background is clinical data management for about 4 years before coming to Protocol First, which is the company that Flatiron acquired. And then biomedical informatics as well. So that's kind of where I'm coming from to look to technically integrate systems like EHR to EDC. So, I guess what I do is, setting up clinical pipe or, our EHR to EDC product with sites, implementing it at the both community and AMC centers, as well as working with sponsor and CRO partners to implement on specific studies.
Nice. You're like, you're the unsung hero in the background doing all the stuff that I don't understand at all. So I appreciate that very much.
Exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I guess just maybe to kick it off a little bit. So, I didn't mention it, but I had a commercial group, which is really focused on the clinical research set of or suite of products that we have and offerings that we have. I should mention a few of the things that are site centric for us, which sit outside of or quasi outside the scope of our world. Is Flatiron does have a sort of leading EHR for oncology practices in the U.S. And then we have some no charge screening tools that are used within OncoEMR called OncoTrials. Those will be out of scope today, but they're germane to the overall sort of impression that we want people to have, is that we're exceedingly site focused on the products and offerings that we have. So I think we'll turn it over to Miles for a little bit of a demo of Vessel, our EDC system, and then transition nicely into a demo of clinical pipe.
Yeah, very cool. I know. I'm actually, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure we just started using Vessel in a project recently. I haven't seen it a whole lot. My coordinators used it a little bit, but you know, I think there's still definitely a need for better EDC tools out there. You know, we all kind of know the main players in the game, and they do, you know, a decent job. I think it's interesting to see kind of different takes on it. And if I do remember correctly, you guys do have a slightly different setup than other EDCs, so it's, you know, cool to be able to see that. So Miles, let me get your stream up there. There we go.
Yeah, and I'll there's obviously a lot to cover with any EDC system. I'll try and cover kind of the high points and what differentiates Vessel from some more traditional, we'll call it EDC systems. So kind of, you know, starting off here, this is what you'd see when you initially log into Vessel. So this is pretty typical, seeing the different studies and even within those different sites. But I think one of the first differences is our concept of building the protocol into the actual EDC system. So, you know, when you first go into one of these sites or studies, you know, any of the users are able to go into all these different aspects of the protocol that we also build into the study as well as the CRF. So things like eligibility, the visit flow, all of the contacts, documents that you'd expect in the study, all of those are built in directly into the system. So the users don't have to go somewhere else, you know, whether it's, you know, just a Google Drive or something similar to that, or even paper documents to find all of this information. All they have to do
that's really cool. And again, I mean, it doesn't seem like you know, huge breakthrough, but I don't know that I've really seen that necessarily with the other EDCs out there to actually have you know, that integrated within. Just be, you know, again, seems like a simple solution, but it's really nice to have a place that, you know, you can go where you're going to have a current version of the forms, or it looked like it even breaks down into like visit flow and eligibility, which again, that's huge as a coordinator, because sometimes you're digging for that stuff in disparate places. So that alone is nice, very nice feature. So sorry, I may interject here and there, but apologies.
No, absolutely. Please, you know, please do as you see things to point out. And this is all updated, you know, along with every protocol update as well. So all of this is going to stay up to date. So you don't have to worry about looking for that latest information as well. You know, I guess I'll just dive into a subject I created here. So, you know, this is a subject where I've only started the screening visit. You know, another thing that we've done is really taking a look at how can we best support these really complicated, you know, oncology trials, lots of branching cycles that can end early, things like that other EDC systems technically can support, but maybe not very elegantly. So, you know, here, and another thing I'll show where we're bringing in the protocol is I can start this, you know, choose between a couple of different branches here quite easily. And then you'll see as well, and not only does this start the CRFs, but this is going to bring up the eligibility criteria once again from the protocol for the site staff to review that. And they need to confirm that they did review that and the subject met that criteria before starting that branch. You know, so once again, the information from the protocol is built directly into the EDC for users to access.
Yeah, and again, I think that's cool. You're hitting kind of two angles there, where, you know, obviously it's a reminder to say, hey, make sure these criteria are being met, but then it's also going to set you off on a branch that, you know, presumably you're not going to see all the stuff that's not relevant from that point forward, which again could be a problem when you have to go in you know, a ton of ECRFs for, depending on what branch you may sort of go down. So again, I love that sort of dual I don't know, feature, I guess, so to speak.
Exactly. And then, you know, exactly, this is you know, how cycles work. So, you know, supposing we're just skipping along here, it's easy enough to add iterations, and the logic for creating out the specific you know, visits is all based on you know, we build the schedule of assessments from the protocol directly into the system. So the user doesn't have to worry about, how many days are in this specific iteration of this cycle. They can just start a new cycle, and it'll build out all of those visits per the protocol. You can see there as well, they could have stopped it early. Obviously that's something that happens a lot in oncology trials. And then finally, once you get to the end of that, either stopping early or just continuing through all of the relevant cycles, then they can continue to a new phase here. So really just trying to make this, building out the schedule of assessments as clean as possible. There's no extraneous CRFs that, data management and site users are going to have to figure out whether they should have been answered or not. Just, that's, another thing that makes this kind of a new approach. And I'll add, this is a very simple example. We support basically anything that can be imagined. And kind of on the back end, the configuration process is such that we can still turn out a new protocol within, usually we quote a few weeks, but really it takes a few days, just with the, how we do it in a configuration-based manner, rather than, kind of a matrix-based programming way that, Rave or Viva would do it.
And I'll actually attest to that, because actually I was a client of the system before I joined Flatiron. So I used Vessel for a global clinical trial, and the EDC was set up in under 10 days. And every time we had a protocol, it was done in a day or two. So there was no more remembering which version of the protocol I was supposed to be using, or waiting for 12 weeks to get UAT done and get the system live. So it's a really fast system.
Nice. And do you guys mind if we interject with questions that come up here? Are you good with that, or you want to wait till the end?
No, question away.
Yeah, please do.
So, going back to sort of the protocol or the implementation, I guess, or integration of the, study documents. I use a central IRB. Everyone uses local IRBs that work off of different, timelines. I guess, how is that sort of managed, or is it really going to still be up to the site to ensure that their IRB has approval? I mean, I can imagine probably not easy to do other than providing the protocol, and then it's really going to, again, be up to the site to ensure that they have IRB approval for that particular version. Is that fair?
So I think that's a great question, something I wanted to get at, and let me know if I'm not getting to what is being asked here. But one of the things I like about Vessel compared to some other EDC systems is that you don't have to wait for all of the sites to be ready for a new protocol version before migrating a study to that new CRF version. You could have every single site on their own protocol version or sub version,
nice.
if you want. And you can update them on a site-by-site basis whenever they're ready. So they're going through their own IRB approval process, and when they're ready for a new protocol, they can go. And so we've had sites or studies rather where, some sites are in the US, some are in the UK, some are in other EU countries, and there's slightly different protocol versions for each of those. And so we don't have to have separate studies within the EDC system to manage that, because we can have a UK protocol and a US protocol and so on.
Got it. So yeah, then it is really being managed on a more site-by-site basis, or can be, I guess. So no, that's awesome. That's interesting. Okay.
And then, I guess I could just jump into the screening visit here. And then, we call them procedures instead of forms, but this is essentially the same thing. And one thing I'll notice when I start this, so let's go to vital signs, for instance. This is going to give kind of an overview of everything that's going to be in there before we start it. One difference is that if for whatever reason, let's say vital signs wasn't performed on this particular visit, I could just go ahead and say, no, this wasn't performed, and go through the kind of this process where now this gets into our exceptions log workflow, where I can create a deviations log and link it to this vital signs that hasn't been performed. So instead of going through every single field that hasn't been filled out and having to, answer a query for that, I can just straight, from the very beginning say, no, it wasn't done, add a deviations log for that if it's required per the protocol. And then that's it. So more typically, you probably would perform this. So I could just say, yes, we did perform this. And this is going to open up this entire form. In fact, this isn't the best example. Let me see here. And so as I start this out, there's going to be a, oops. Okay, this is going to be a better example. Sorry about that. There's a few things going on here. So kind of at the top here, you're going to see this guidance. So this is another idea, trying to bring more information directly into the EDC that typically would live outside. So really, this is where we're taking the CRF completion guidelines and building them directly into the form for site users to see and even confirm here as they're going through the form. So instead of having separate CRF completion guidelines, now it's just built directly into your EDC system. So it can either be a notice, which is just text that's up there for them to see, this guidance, which has these confirmation boxes, and it's up to the sponsor or CRO how which one they want to do, and then source guidance, which is specific to source, which I'll come back to in a moment. And then for data entry, this is what it looks like. So doing manual data entry, this is like most EDC systems. One of the differences is maybe going to be if I start typing in a value here, you can see that this is now highlighted yellow. So that means I'm currently editing it. And when I click away, it's going to flash blue here, and that means it's saved. So if the internet went down right now, this data wouldn't be lost because there's no save form button at the bottom. It's saved in real time. So that's nice. And another thing I can show quickly here is kind of referring back to that exceptions workflow I mentioned earlier. So not the most realistic values, but just for demonstration here, if I enter in a value that's going to be, for instance, outside the reference range, we don't have to program sort of automatic queries for that. There's this built-in exceptions workflow system where it's going to trigger an exception, sort of automatic logic based on this being outside the reference range. And then there's a process where the user can say whether it's clinically significant or not, or a protocol deviation, and then link those to the logs that would be appropriate for that. So we can even create a new adverse event log and link that back to this.
Yeah, that's cool to be able to do it from that page rather than have to go either ditch the data you've got to go make the adverse event and then go back, so that and then you can connect it to the adverse event, which I've seen instances like that. So yeah, again, that's a nice feature there.
Exactly. And I won't go through all this because logs work how you'd expect. This isn't probably as important for a site user, but what's I think really cool from my background is that we also another thing we do with Vessel is export everything to SDTM at the end. So it's kind of natively collected and exported to SDTM, which is what the FDA requires. And by even this reference to, linking this potassium value to this adverse event log, that's carried over into that export. So it's kind of all linked together. Nice. I do want to be aware of time here and be able to show how Clinical Pipe is going to work with this. So I know there's a lot to show with any EDC system, but hopefully that gives a general idea of kind of what makes Vessel a little bit different.
Sure. And it looks like, I know you briefly mentioned it, but it looks like you could upload source right there at the visit level, not even the visit level, but the procedure level, really. Which again is not something I don't know that I've really seen across most EDC, but I have to think that makes it much easier on the back end to have it associated with the specific visit or again specific assessment or procedure versus maybe sometimes we're sending like 60 pages of source in one big file, and here you figure it out, So again, I think that's kind of nice to have everything well organized and sort of one-to-one, so to speak.
There's a really cool feature for this too, because it's GDPR compliant, Part 11 compliant. I used this during COVID, and there's a cool feature for monitoring too that you can do side by side. So you see the source for the actual visit that you're looking at as well. It's a really nice feature.
Yeah, it makes monitoring
a lot
so
easier.
much simpler.
Yeah,
so much simpler. No, that makes sense.
And I see some comments about local lab savings, and the next part is you're really going to enjoy the next part. This is already a savings for local labs. Clinical Pipe really does this on steroids. It's a fantastic feature.
Nice, yes, and I appreciate that question, Joe. we'll show you.
Shout out, Joe. What's up?
Yeah. So speaking of local labs, so this is OncoEMR. We're really only showing this to show how Clinical Pipe works to transfer data from EHR to EDC. This is going to work the same for, if you're using Epic or Cerner as your EHR. So Clinical Pipe is, pretty EHR agnostic. So really, what we want to do here is just find the patient we want to transfer the data for. And at that point, just launch Clinical Pipe. So regardless of what EHR system you're using, there's going to be a button, if it's set up at your site, to launch Clinical Pipe from that specific patient. So we can see our patient details are up here on the left-hand side to confirm we're working with the right person. And then it's telling us to link them. So here in Clinical Pipe, you're going to get a list of the studies that have been set up for the particular site you're working at. So in this case, I just have 2 to choose from, and I know which one I want to work with. And then you just need to type in the subject number as it appears in the EDC system. And I can even show, this is our subject here. And, none of these are started. We haven't sent any data over yet. And then this linking process is Clinical Pipe is kind of communicating with the EDC system, in this case Vessel, to make sure that subject exists. And it's also checking the user's access. So it's making sure that, my user account, which is being pulled out of the EHR system, matches a user that's in the EDC system. So there's no separate user management. It's all kind of, you just click and launch it, and the rest is automatic. So that's nice. There's no additional passwords to remember. And then assuming that you are a valid user, you're going to get a list of the CRFs. So this is where, Flatiron works with the sponsor, the CRO, to find all of the forms and fields in the EDC system that, can have structured data transferred from the EHR. And then we end up with this list of CRFs. And this is where you come to, say, vital signs. And this is actually pulling in all of the vital signs forms that are currently available in the EDC system. So everything's being driven by what's happening to the subject in the EDC, currently. So you don't have to think about, oh, has this treatment 1B cycle been created yet? No, it's communicating with the EDC to figure that out for you. And then from here, kind of the easy way to select data is just to go to these drop downs, and then you can select data based on kind of the date and time that it was collected in the EHR system. So typically you'd select something that matches the visit date here, but the site does have complete control over what data they want to select and send. So they do have the option to select different data if they believe that's what's appropriate. And you can see they can select data for more than one visit or more than one time point at a time, and then kind of send a big batch of data if they feel they need to do that. So if you're behind on data entry, this can be a great way to catch up with that.
So presumably this is being mapped in the background or mapped beforehand through your EHR. Maybe, and I don't know, I'm not smart enough to know how that works, but I assume it's something that happens sort of in the background beforehand. and this is maybe it just addresses a question that someone else had. Do you guys work with anything outside of EHR, like, eSource or, CMS or CTMS, things like that? Or are you guys still really just focused in on the EHR specifically at this point?
So right now, at least for Clinical Pipe, the focus is on, getting data out of the EHR and sending it over to the EDC. So,
yeah. Yeah, and just a couple points, and Miles can speak to the actual mapping that he personally does, and it's mapping within Clinical Pipe between EHR and EDC. You mentioned eSource, and I'm kind of chuckling a little bit, Brad, in that this is sort of the de facto, what I would say, best way to accomplish eSource. So this is the best tactic to actually accomplish eSource as an umbrella term for a certain sort of strategy, data flow strategy. So, but in terms of the integration piece, we're looking at EHR as, the source of truth for clinical data. And we certainly have plans for furthering expansion relative to how many sites that use it, as well as the mappability and the ability to get the full array of the patient's clinical trial experience from an EHR into the EDC, without having the site essentially have to do very much on their side.
Sure.
We feel that burden.
Yeah, and I'd say also from a site perspective, there's always concern about how much is it going to take to actually implement Clinical Pipe and get it in a site. We typically say it's somewhere between 20 and 30 hours spread across 3 IT resources if you're on Epic or Cerner. So it's not huge. It doesn't cost anything. The sponsors do have to help map the study on the back end for the EDC, because we have to have access to their EDC system. But from a site perspective, it's low lift. And once that initial mapping is done, there's nothing that needs to be done going forward other than controlling access to your own EMR.
Yeah, and we have a fun. Oh, sorry, Brad.
Well, I was going to say, and forgive me if I missed this, but the Clinical Pipe, it can exist completely independent of whether Vessel is the EDC. Is that right, or is it strictly for Vessel EDC?
It works with Vessel and Rave right now.
Gotcha.
Yep, and then we're also looking at which other ones are going to be the biggest benefit.
Sure. Cool.
To sites and to
Sorry, I
sponsors.
wasn't making sure I wasn't making any assumptions. So no, it's interesting too that it works with Rave. We all know Rave does a fairly big chunk of our EDC work for a lot of the studies we do. And no, the question more too was like, I've had this debate, I guess, or not even debate, but conversation, because we work in oncology now. We work with a system, but really not all of our data is in the EMR. We also have a different relationship than probably your more traditional oncology sites do. And understandably, your more traditional, so to speak, oncology sites probably are primarily using EHR as their source. But I'm always really interested in things that are sort of agnostic to the source. But I guess that's another philosophical question, right? Like, should it all be contained in their EMR or not? And sometimes it's not. Obviously, local labs will be anyway. So some of those things make a lot of sense. But that's where I think it's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Miles, you want to hand it back to you? Or?
Yeah, and I can actually speak a little bit about the mapping process as I go through this here. So this is kind of a more detailed view of that the user can open of exactly what data points they're going to send over to this form, and what values would be transferred, and they could even select a different value for these individually. So it's really leaving complete control over what data you're sending over. It's a little bit on rails in that you can't send anything except for heart rate to the heart rate field, which is what you'd want, of course. So you're just choosing which instance of that you'd want to transfer. And as far as the mapping process, what we're doing is we're going through, each of these fields with the sponsor and saying, basically this is a list of the possible observations that could come from an EHR that would be appropriate to send to this given field in the EDC. and then that's how we come up with the mapping. And so, once the user's happy with what they've selected as far as data, they just click this Submit Data to EDC button here. It's just going to take a moment to check that there's no pre-existing data already in the EDC that might be overwritten, and then it's in the system there.
Nice.
And works the same for example, hematology or chemistry, as it does for vital signs. So I could transfer this as well. You see in this case, there's a couple of observations that aren't found for this particular date and time. But you could select from a different date and time if that's what the user wanted to do, and then just submit that as well.
I mean, and this is the use case, right, where we've all had those patients that you had to use 2 different screening labs to get them qualified and into the study. You want to make sure you have control over that and aren't pushing the data that you don't intend to use as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I love the idea of look, you're clearly not having to go line by line, typing it all out. You can pull, probably a majority of the labs are going to be perfectly fine, but yeah, you do have that flexibility to say, well, okay, it wasn't that one, it was the following one. So we're going to make sure that we're able to really discern that. So no, I think I love that.
Exactly. I think if you take away too much control from the coordinators, then you have all kinds of issues. So if I close this out now and go back into our screening here, all of these are going to be transferred in. So not just the values, but also units and reference ranges all come through as well from EHRs. Those are part of that. And the only ones here, there's some unmapped observations for this hematology. So in theory, if there were some observations that were left unmapped, then you'd still have to go in and manually enter those the way it works right now. Typically, you wouldn't have too many of those though. And then things like, the exceptions workflow I showed, or, in Rave, all your queries, those are going to work exactly the same. So it's not breaking any of the functionality in EDC.
Nice. Yeah, no, I mean, I do love this. And I guess, is it fair you guys are primarily focused in the oncology space as of now?
Yes, and I will say, so Clinical Pipe's not going to be a great fit for like a late phase registry in a certain study, right? It's just not the type of data collected in those studies isn't going to be meaningful enough to use Clinical Pipe. Where I think it's incredibly helpful is also inpatient populations, nephrology, where you're doing labs because of dialysis, things like that, where you're repeating labs a lot, or you have a lot of medications because meds also transfer. Or if you have daily visits, it really does do a good fit. So it's oncology, and I mean, Vessel's really built to handle complex studies, which a lot of them are oncology. It's not the only one.
Sure.
So Clinical Pipe is kind of the same.
Well, and I do think too, to even kind of, I know I touched on it a little bit, but to speak to Joe's point, like oncology seems to me, again, to have the most data that's going to be in your EHR almost regardless, no matter what your kind of setup is. For us, it gets weird because we work with a lot of different practices, different EHRs. We're not part of those institutions, so we don't have the full range of access as maybe a normal, institutionally owned, research program would. So that makes it a little bit trickier, maybe. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, again, I can see how that's very appropriate to the oncology space. I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah, and just to add to Emily's very very discreetly is that technically both Clinical Pipe and Vessel are TA agnostic. It really is a matter of, is a study a good fit or not? You can take a study that has low amount of patients or a small patient population, but per patient, there's sort of a high mappability. And you're like, okay, that seems great. And it could be the opposite, where you could have tons and tons of data per site because there's, like a cardiovascular trial where there's tons of patients, and maybe there are, a couple per patient, variables per patient that map. That's also a great fit. And so what we like to do is, as sort of a free service for anyone that kind of comes to us, is they send us a protocol. We look at the protocol and look for applicability, and we can kind of frame that up against sites that use clinical pipe and actual mappability of different domains and procedures and events. And we don't want to sell something that's not going to be of value. So we like to do that prior to as a service, sort of in pre-sales, if you will.
Sure, and that makes sense too. I mean, to your point, a lot of stuff's not in structured data, I guess, which I assume is a much harder hill to climb, if can be climbed at all. I don't know. I'm not that smart to be able to know, but I mean, we certainly see that with different. Yeah, and we see that with different types of trials for sure. I mean, some are, labs, obviously pretty easy. Seems easily mappable. I say this stuff with no technical knowledge, so I'm happy to be proven wrong if that's the case, but feel free to call me out. But, if you're having to pull data out of a long narrative, which is sometimes the case with surgical trials or whatever the case may be, then, that can become, I assume more challenging than sort of the one, so to speak.
Yeah, appreciate that. And just the one point, and follow on to what Emily said about working on it, is, in terms of unstructured data, there are ways that hopefully we're going to be able to get to those data and, again, alleviate burden on site, because a decent percentage, a good chunk of data, very critical data, are in unstructured form. So again, we just want to take as much burden off the site as possible, and they still have full control of their EHR. They always have full control of the EDC system, but the ability to get from A to B, we would love to help just get rid of that sort of artificial burden that came about 25 or so years ago.
Well, I mean, look, I'm of the opinion that anything that helps is good. Yeah. And almost, again, even just labs alone can become ridiculously cumbersome depending on, patient volume or volume of labs or whatever the case may be. And having to enter reference intervals and dealing with, various units of measurement, it can just be very tedious. So anything that helps that process along, I mean, I'm for it regardless of method, as long as it's accurate, obviously.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And sorry, I was going to say, from a sponsor perspective, particularly with Vessel, we have sponsors that are using Vessel, that if you're in a data management group or even a monitoring group where you're having to manage those local labs and units, the CP and Vessel connection together, it sort of makes that activity moot, and the eyes light up from someone saying, you just saved me, 3 days a week from managing local labs. And it's just a huge productivity shift to be able to do other things of much higher value. I
wondered that. And if that's, obviously that kind of rolls, I guess, uphill in a way. I mean, it's easier for the coordinator, but it becomes easier for any kind of monitoring. And, again, you can probably rest assured that data is going to be not, transcribed incorrectly, as a coordinator can easily do. We've all done it. We get a little fat fingered sometimes and type things wrong. So you're taking that out of the equation. So you're saving time and money on both ends, really.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and what we've actually found with Clinical Pipe too is sponsors are able to save cost in just the duration of the trial how long the trial lasts. Because the data entry, the latency for regular data entry, I mean, we all know sometimes it's 60 days, sometimes it's 5 days. They all want it 5 days. Sponsors always want the data in 5 days. It's not always possible. But we found with Clinical Pipe, the lab comes in and gets reviewed and it's pushed that day. So you're seeing some signals a little bit easier. It's a little bit easier to manage timelines. And then SDV isn't needed on these modules. Monitors still have to look and make sure, yes, the lab for the 14th is the one that they should have used.
Right.
But they're not checking if you accidentally put a decimal place in the wrong, position as well. There's some savings in pain, money, and time from a couple of different factors there.
So the same way that you can you can upload your source, it looks like on a manually, but if you're using pipe, could it not just as easily pull that file over and make it available so they can be easily reviewed by monitors?
Not yet.
Fair.
Yeah, not yet. But it's right there. Yeah.
Emily, you hit on a couple things I want to really emphasize, is particularly that data latency piece. Brad, is we've seen over and over patient visit, data received, and if you look at sort of how long does it take for data to get there, you see a graph of non-clinical pipe sites, and it's kind of a long horizontal linear kind of thing, and 40 days, 50 days, and then you just see this tiny little width of a human hair on a bar chart of data latency for clinical pipe sites, and it's really truly remarkable. And if you extrapolate that out to database lock, what does it actually look like for the clinical pipe sites versus the non-clinical pipe sites? And you can see who would be the rate limiter. And so that's a tremendous thing to see. And to the SDV piece, it's nuanced, but to our CRO friends out there that might see that maybe as a headwind, we've fortunately seen CROs love clinical pipe because they can just shift SDV activity to a much higher value monitoring activity. There's no, you stop SDV and there's sort of this no net reason to monitor. There's plenty of work for everyone to do.
Right.
Just much.
No, but it is. It's look. It's better if we could work smarter, right? That's certainly. We have a lot of room to grow in that area, and this certainly helps get us down the road a little bit further.
Yeah, this is the TPS report version of
right.
For everyone old enough to know that.
Right. Little Office Space shout out.
Yeah.
Well, very cool. We have more. Are we going to jump into some of these questions over here? What else we got? We're getting down to about the last 10 minutes or so.
I think I've showed pretty much everything there is with clinical pipe. It's really meant to be as simple as possible to use, just to get the data over. I think the last thing I would show is, going back to the SDV piece, is at least when you're sending data into Vessel, we do have this icon here, which indicates that the data is considered source and doesn't need to be SDV'd. So it makes it really easy for a monitor coming back in here to see that that's not something they need to SDV. So that's a nice feature.
Nice.
But yeah, I think we've covered clinical pipe at this point.
Yeah, I think we could definitely move over to the questions.
Let's see. Anything? Feel free to shout out anything you see. Some of these are probably even some of these are technically over my head, even, to be perfectly honest. But
hey, Miles, can you talk about the startup speed of Vessel and just how we do that? Because I know it's one of those things that nobody really believes until you've been through it. So just how Vessel is different and how we are able to do it that quickly.
Yeah, it's a little hard to describe why it's so much easier kind of on our end to configure studies in Vessel as opposed to how you do it in most other EDC systems, other than it's just the way we configure a study in Vessel is you basically just set some parameters to say, this is the protocol, this is the schedule of assessments, these are the procedures you should see there, and things like that. You're not building out all these complicated matrices to specify everything. So it's a lot faster both to build it and then to test it and make sure it's working. And we also don't really have a lot of custom scripts, layer on top of everything to make it all work, which adds a lot of complexity as well.
And there's a good component of digitization. Correct, Miles?
Yeah, kind of that concept of the protocol being digitized and sort of living in the system, that speeds the whole process up. We just basically transfer the protocol into this it just lives in the EDC, which means it's digitized, and then really all we have to do is look and make sure that the schedule of assessments is built out correctly, that we have the right, labs and fields in each of those procedures that are built out. But it's not nearly as much work as it is to build a RAVE or a Viva study.
So I've got a couple of questions. There may be kind of spin-offs of some of these questions. One, this is from Archana. I don't know why your name doesn't show up, but thank you, Archana, for the question. I guess being able to, get real-time, patient monitoring, does that feed in any way? I mean, oftentimes perhaps, what if a patient hits the ER, they're getting a lab, maybe it's an AE or an SAE, we don't know. Is there some value here, or is that something that's maybe, been considered? If that connection already exists, is that something that could be flagged? Because a lot of times we aren't looking at every patient in their EMR every day. I may not notice that, but if you've got a connection that's pulling data, that's something that could be made maybe more apparent.
Yeah, that's almost like a large healthcare sort of portability question regarding, if a patient in a clinical trial is seen at another location, until those data make it into the clinical research EHR, or the EHR at the where the clinical research being done, then there's no or limited visibility relative to clinical pipe. Certainly from a study perspective, there's medical monitoring set up to manage just that. But from a strictly, I think, technical perspective, that would sort of be like a EHR to EHR to EDC right. Kind of world.
I will say one of the things that I don't think we demonstrated for Vessel is the reporting piece for Vessel is incredibly flexible, as opposed to, waiting. If you worked in a CRO or sponsor and you requested a report, it typically takes a couple weeks to get that scoped, get programming on it, that type of thing. And then it comes out in a PDF. And maybe you can get it in Excel, maybe you can, it's got lines missing. Everything in Vessel exports in real time in CSV that you can pull anytime you want it. So say I had a study where ventilation status was a really big thing. So we'd go through and look, we'd pull the AE report a couple times a day and look for new ventilation events so that we could get additional things reported or intervene for the patient. Same goes with labs. Those labs come in so quickly, you're able to look in real time across multiple patients just by pulling a report and saying, yep, I want this lab, give it to me. It's pretty easy. Pivot table it, do it in Excel, look for changes from baseline, as opposed to waiting for the delivery of those reports. Like you can, put columns next to you and do all sorts of stuff that isn't possible, say, in RAVE.
Interesting.
I'm just noticing a comment on the from one of our many LinkedIn users that says we should be using it for every study. It's a I appreciate the comment. Couldn't agree more. And we have certainly a fun problem to solve in terms of sponsors wanting more and more sites to actually adopt this. And that's exactly why Emily and her group are working tirelessly every day. And then sites are saying, well, to sponsors, well, bring me a study or two and let's get talking. And so for our sponsor friends, there should be no hesitancy with this. It is an incredibly, incredibly valuable piece of a much larger puzzle. And there's appetite from both sides, and it seems like we just need to bring them closer and closer together. And that's what we do.
I'd say the one other thing, just because I always want to plug that we're trying to find value for sites too, is for oncology specific cooperative group studies that are funded by the NCI. Sites lose money doing these, but they're critically important. So we are trying to work with them to get clinical pipe into those studies to make the money you lose less, to make it easier to get to that critical data. So that's definitely something that Flatiron's working on to try to ease the site burden for those critical trials as well.
Yeah, I think that's very underrated. I mean, your point again. A lot of those trials are not far from financially lucrative for sites. So the less time they can spend having to do manual work, I think the more likely you're going to get participation, right? I mean, that's what we want. We want sites to participate. We know that it's not always going to be a gold rush, but if it can at least be less cumbersome, then it's going to be a lot more incentivized to participate. So I love that. I love that perspective.
Absolutely.
Well, cool, guys. I think that's a great place to end. That's also that comments from Archana. Again, thank you, Archana, for chiming in. And someday we'll get figured out why your name doesn't show up and you're not getting your props out there. But otherwise, anything else before we wind down here, guys?
No, appreciate everyone who joined. Brad, appreciate the forum. Certainly Miles for demoing, Emily for joining. It's such a busy day. And enjoy. We'll see anyone and everyone at ASCO.
Yeah.
So cheers if you're going.
Thanks so much for having us, Brad.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'm really overwhelmed and I don't know, optimistic by the people who want to come on and share what they're doing. I think it's great for everybody to sort of see and learn from each other, and for sites to see there's stuff out there that can help. People are working on it. I think it's brave to come out and show it off. Not everyone will do it, so I give you guys a lot of credit for that. So
cool.
All right, guys.
You
reach out, Flatiron Health. You can find these guys. You guys all on LinkedIn, I assume.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
So go bother them, ask them questions, hit them up, and tune in next week, Tuesday noon Eastern on Note to File Live.